And we are on the air.
All right, good evening. Sorry for the slight delay, but your favorite TV show is now on. So I'd like to start off the meeting of the January 28th, 2020 of the Growth Planning Committee with the introduction of members and guests.
Warner Gilliam.
Dan Saunders.
Barbara Barwas.
Janet Powell.
Paul Hogan.
Paul Hogan's joining us from afar. And guests?
Tom Morgan.
Liz Durfee.
All right. Thank you very much. First order of business is January 14th minutes. Any discussion on the minutes? Hearing none, I'll take a motion. Jan, you want to make a motion to? All right, I'll second those. All those in favor? All right. Minutes passed. Thank you, Barbara.
You.
Okay, so now number 3 is introduction section of the comprehensive plan.
Hey, can we post those minutes on the website? There's a
Sure.
section for them, but we haven't posted.
I'm pretty sure they're already up there, Paul.
Oh, I looked today, okay.
They're at the same time.
Yeah, Barbara sent them along a week ago, so I'm pretty sure they're up.
They went out Friday morning.
Yeah.
On the website.
Yeah. But I will double check.
They'd be on the town website, I would think.
Oh, is that, which
They-
website you're talking about, Paul?
I was looking at the comp plan website,
Oh, okay.
where we have a tab for it.
All right, well, I will double check.
Thank you.
So, am I close enough to the mic here?
Sounds good?
Yeah.
I can hear you fine.
Okay, fine. I'm going to tell you about the introduction chapter to the comprehensive plan. And it's a little bit expanded over the 2012 version. You had some good material in 2012, and most of that I didn't want to lose, so it's a lot of it's been incorporated into the new introduction, but it's kind of interweaved with new material with the old. I'm going to speak mostly about the new material because you're already familiar with what's in the 2012. And you recall back in November when Cameron Wake was here, Liz and I were also speaking, and we one of the topics we covered was the constitutional foundation for land use regulations in the United States. And the suggestion was made then to fit that into the comp plan somewhere, somehow. So I thought I'd try it out right here at the very beginning, just so people, everybody in this room knows what zoning is and a comprehensive plan, but not everybody out there can be expected to know that stuff. And it's kind of an interesting story how we got here. And that's what we're doing a brief little tour of that in the introduction. And the first one is the parts of the U.S. Constitution that are applicable to zoning and comprehensive planning. And up on the screen here, you can see that the Fifth Amendment is relevant because that's when the founder said, you can't just take somebody's property without compensation and due process. So that's baked into the cake, and that Congress can't get around that even if they wanted to. 10th Amendment was after they got the Constitution got finished. Is that me making that noise? Or,
No, it's Paul.
Okay.
Excuse me one second. Hey, Paul, would it be possible to mute yourself until you wanted to speak? That's our standard protocol in Skype meetings.
Okay. So.
Thank you.
So in the original document, the founder set out certain powers that the federal government would hold. And then in the 10th Amendment, they said anything that we haven't specified to belong to the federal government is for the states, and they can figure out how they want to take care of that. So one of the provisions that they allocated to the state were the traditional police powers. This goes back to medieval England. This is common law, common English law that the colonists here kind of inherited, and then the folks that drafted the U.S. Constitution inherited as well. That they called police powers. At that time, they consisted of regulating health, safety, morals, and general welfare. Then the Civil War came along, and the African slaves were freed, but the Congress was afraid they weren't going to get a fair deal down in the South, so they passed the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which said everybody, regardless of skin color, gets equal protection and due process. And quickly, property owners lawyers said this is applicable to land as well, and ever since the 14th Amendment has been applied to real estate development as well as to civil rights. In 1922, the little village of Euclid outside of Cleveland was afraid industry was going to expand from Cleveland into Euclid and going to spoil their village. So they passed an early zoning ordinance, and it was challenged in court. It went to the Supreme Court in 1926. The United States Supreme Court, for the first time, ruled that zoning was constitutional and lawful. But they also reminded Euclid and everybody else that in order to be lawful, you have to, it can't be arbitrary and it can't be unreasonable. And hold that thought, because we'll run into it momentarily, why it has to do with a comprehensive plan. Meanwhile, in the state of Maine, a fellow named Libby down in York Harbor wanted to establish a camping ground conducted for a private gain. I love how they worded that. And that was the plaintiff, York Harbor, that used that language to describe Mr. Libby's business. But they had two zones, A and B, and Mr. Libby happened to have some land in the zone where he wasn't allowed to have a camping ground. So he went about setting up his tents anyways, and the York Harbor Village Corporation brought suit. That made it to the Maine Supreme Judicial Court in 1928, and that court ruled in favor of York Harbor. They said that the zoning ordinance in York Harbor is consistent with Maine's Constitution. So you got two affirmatives here: the U.S. Supreme Court saying it's okay with the federal, and the Maine court saying it's okay with the Maine court. And over in the right, the lower right, that's what Mr. Libby's campground looked like around 1945. Now, recall in the 10th Amendment, the Congress delegated the public welfare to states and localities. But public welfare is kind of a vague term, and Justice Douglas thought he had kind of a broad view of what that meant, and this is where he spelled it out. And it was this case, Berman v. Parker, that the U.S. Supreme Court kind of expanded the concept of public welfare to include, protecting natural resources and historic resources. And now we also, in this new introduction, we've introduced a little bit of history. Werner, I hope you can correct us if I missed one here or got any wrong. But what I could find out is you did comprehensive plans in 1996, 2005, and 2012. Did I miss any?
I'll double check that.
Okay. All right.
And those are the ones that that I've dealt with the most.
Okay.
But I'll check back in the vault to see if we had anything prior to '96.
So 2005.
2005. Well, says they were prepared. 96 was approved by the voters. 2005 wasn't approved by the voters.
Mm-hmm.
2003, was that voted on?
Yes.
So it's like 2005.
That's right. 2003 and 2005 were not approved by the voters.
Right.
Oh.
So.
Anyways, there was a lot of planning going on.
Yeah,
That's a good thing. Yeah.
I don't know how technical you want to get with that statement, but
No, I just want to make sure I'm not saying something that's factually incorrect.
Right.
And recall the back in the Euclid decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said it can't be arbitrary and it can't be unreasonable. And that's where comprehensive planning comes in. That's how come you can prove that your zoning ordinance isn't out there just, making things up as they go along, but that there's some thought behind it, and there's a process, and there's kind of a grand scheme, and there is a public purpose that should come out in the comprehensive plan as well. We're doing this, we recommend this because it's, the public needs this to protect them, whatever you happen to be talking about. Yeah. Then, this is not new language, this is right out of your 2012. I thought it covered the territory fairly well, so there's nothing new there. Why prepare a plan? But I like to comment, aside from the requirement to have a plan, it just makes sense for towns to plan for the future. So even if these state laws didn't exist, it's a good idea to figure out what's down the road, and so the town and community can prepare themselves for it. And then, we also are aware that your earlier plans didn't tackle climate change in a direct sort of way, and we're going to be much more forward about that this time around. So we're pointing out here is that this is the first comprehensive plan that's really going to take on climate change. You got, anybody, I'm sure you can all figure out where that aerial photograph is, huh? Yeah, all right. Now, the introduction chapter is not quite finished because Liz and I were talking when we got to this point, and we realized that, you know, we want to do a little bit more work on this part of the chapter. So we've really kind of served up the first half tonight, and we're gonna get back to you with the rest of it. The rest of it will be about, you know, how we're introducing climate change into the comprehensive plan. So anybody have any comments or questions?
No, I like the idea of bringing in what you did at the presentation about the basis in law, all the way from common law coming from England, basically,
Yeah,
to here. So
That's-
that kind of gives the reason why to everybody.
yeah,
And then, of course, bringing up the fact that we're going to be addressing climate change and specifically sea level rise and how that will impact our town, I think is real important in the introduction section.
good,
Because that'll be throughout the whole plan, right? Or most chapters anyways.
right. Anybody else have any comments or questions about the introduction?
Well, sustainability.
I would just,
Go ahead, Paul.
in the climate change paragraph for 3, I think we already are experiencing building and road floodings. So instead of saying will soon, I would try to rephrase that.
It's already here.
Right. And I wasn't sure that the second to last sentence, that we might have to revisit the designated growth areas. And I was wondering whether they are that affected.
We don't know yet. We'll be taking a look at the groundwater and what parts of town might be impacted by that. And so the jury's still out on that one. Yeah, that's why I said May.
So we're gonna be working sustainability out through all the different chapters as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah, should we introduce that to some level within the,
In the introduction? Yeah, we
Yeah.
can throw in a couple sentences. And, yeah,
those are really two main themes that the new one's gonna bring, the new
Right.
plan will
Yes.
bring.
yeah.
Okay.
No, good thought, Dan.
And I guess back to the plan that didn't get approved, I think we shouldn't mention it, or, you know, we've had 2 plans that have been approved by voters, not 3 or 4.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I mean, there were plans that were prepared and then there were plans that were approved.
Which way do you want to go? Do you have a preference?
I would just say comprehensive plans were approved by Kennebunkport voters in
Yeah,
96 and 12.
Yeah.
Okay. Take out 2005?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds of the history of comp planning. but
No, I mean, it's,
That's a small book in and of
I don't think we
itself.
do.
we don't need to, and
It's
I,
a whole shelf in the archives.
It is.
Didn't want to slight anybody by
no,
leaving them out.
well, I think like in our existing one, we have a reference to the work that they did in
Okay.
those plans, and we can keep
Okay.
that. You know,
Okay.
'cause,
All right, so we'll go 96 and 12 then.
yeah,
Yeah.
2003, 2005 was a good basis for what was ultimately approved.
Yeah, Yeah, and I'll double check in the vault, see if there were any older versions,
Okay.
that were approved.
Yeah. Janet, when I was at the library that night, somebody told me there was some old stuff down in the basement. Did I remember that correctly? Yeah.
It's an archival
There's
room.
an archive.
Yeah, that there might be some comprehensive planning down there.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that if you come by, Mary Lou would be more than happy to help you with that.
Mhm. Sure.
There's a lot of town reports.
Right,
I
19
don't know if there's anything about the comp plan.
Yeah,
Anything in the
1996.
comp plan would be in the
But that
archives
would
at
be
the town
at
office.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. That's good to know. Any other questions or comments on the introduction? Hearing none?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good start.
Good, thank you. Liz is going to tell you all about the existing land use chapter.
All right, so I hope everyone's had a chance to take a look at the first draft of the existing land use chapter. Unlike the 2012 plan, we've decided to break out existing and future land use into two separate chapters. Future land use will be the last chapter that we work on developing, and this chapter will have some bits and pieces that are added to it throughout the process also. But for this chapter, we wanted to just paint a picture of some of the existing conditions, and then I'll ask for some feedback from all of you on some of the development trends that are a little harder to tease out from some of the data that we have available. Feel free to interrupt at any point during this overview too. So here's the chapter, the main components of this chapter. There's a brief overview of land use, a discussion of conservation land, current use, the different zoning districts, a quick summary of natural features and characteristics. This information will be covered in more detail in the natural resources and water resources chapters. And then a sort of preliminary development constraints discussion. So the first map that we've included shows the land use by land cover type, and this is from a regional data set that is developed by NOAA, and it's based on a 30-meter grid or 30-meter pixels, so it's not exact, but it is a data source that can be used to look at land cover change over time. I didn't include that in Kennebunkport's plan because there wasn't a drastic amount of change at this scale since the, I think 2001 is the other, 2001 and 2010 is the other data point that they have. So this shows, most of, a majority of the community is, I don't want to say open space, but in a sort of a natural cover, forested or wetland. The development that shows up is, you can see some darker areas, mostly the impervious road cover, and some of the areas that are more highly developed. This map also shows land use. It looks quite a bit different. This is based on the assessing records and parcel data that the town has. And so this shows sort of a high-level analysis of the different land use classifications that are associated with the assessing data. So the yellow is showing residential, and that accounts for about 46% of the community. There's very little industrial, and there's quite a few different categories of exempt or partially exempt land uses. The next section of the chapter summarizes the conservation land, and the data that I used for this map is from the main office of GIS, and the conserved lands layer contains 3 different sets of data, and that's what I've shown in the 3 different colors here. So it shows permanent conserved land. So that's either land that's has a permanent conservation easement on it or a deed restriction. Permanent natural cover, that's shown in the peach. And unsecured lands, which the unsecured lands in peach includes municipal lands that are already developed, so your schools or your library, land that's not likely to be developed but may not be conserved forest, for example.
We've got another big area off Mills Road.
Off of Mills Road?
Just recently purchased by the Conservation Trust.
Oh, great. And Tom and I have been in touch. We're trying to arrange a meeting with the Conservation Trust to make sure that we have the most current data
Yeah.
available. What road was it off of?
It's off Mills Road.
Mills
It's
Road.
sort of in where you've got that Oak Ridge. It's just below that.
Okay. Oh, great. Well, that's exciting.
Yep, and there's
Yeah.
another chunk that's off of Route 9.
Yeah, rather a large one, to 52
Okay.
acres or something like that.
Yeah, there's a piece here. One thing I did just notice, I think on the label placement, you probably want those flipped, on, the unsecured 449 acres, that probably wants to be up by the pink.
On the pie chart versus.
On the
Yes,
pie
I
chart
just
there.
saw that too.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. I confused myself. Thank you for catching that. Okay. Conservation projects by year. The state data set that I have showed that the most recent conservation project was in 2011, and I imagine that's not correct. So once we are able to check in with the Conservation Trust, we can make sure that we have the most current data. Some of this information, I think, does reflect the town-owned lands that aren't permanently protected, and so that may be why the data set doesn't have the year that the project was conserved, or the year the parcel became conserved land, because it's town-owned land. One of the questions I have, though, is are you interested in having this data aggregated here as part of the conservation projects by year, or would you rather me tease out the permanent conservation land and keep the town-owned land separate? Any opinions on that?
Defer to Werner.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean,
I think if they could be separate.
yeah.
Separate?
I'd separate.
Yeah, I mean, you could have them separate on the same chart with just
Yep.
2 different colors in the column.
Okay.
Yeah.
Town-owned and conservation. At least it's more information that's on.
All right.
In the town, we have, the opportunity to do other stuff with it.
Right. yeah,
Right.
I mean,
People should know that, it's not.
There are certainly,
Yeah.
some pieces that are town-owned, that are restricted, through a deed
Yes.
restriction.
Right.
Short of just going through and individually researching those, I mean, that's, I don't know what other data source that you have to kind of pull those out.
Well, we have.
I know of a fair number of those,
Yeah.
so.
The data layer, the state data layer has the ownership information, and it's, I don't know why the attribute's called the gap status, and that is the ranking of permanent, temporary, or permanent in a natural state. So I can tease out the information a little bit more that way.
Yeah.
There is another map that we'll get to later on that does show the town-owned lands and the conservation lands, and you can see that some of the town-owned land is not considered conservation land.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next section just highlights parcels that are in current use. Maine has 4 current use programs that that offer property owner reduction in the assessed value, and those programs are tree growth, which is by far the most popular in Kennebunkport, farmland, open space, and working waterfront. I found that looking at the data over time, the number of properties that are participating has declined a little bit over time, but the acreage of land that's actually in the program has stayed fairly constant for the most part. And there's just a small parcel.
I go back to one other,
Yeah.
one thing that may be helpful to see on the conservation land piece,
Yeah,
would be maybe some of the subdivision open space that's been restricted as open space. I mean, I guess that's probably considered another subset of conservation land. Even though
Okay.
it might be privately owned by the homeowners association, it's, it's essentially provides the same, or a lot of the same attributes.
and do you have that data?
Yeah,
or is
it's,
that-
so I
Oh,
think.
that's something that's in the assessing, okay.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it shows
Perfect.
up as a category here in the land use by
Oh,
parcel.
right, okay.
In the open
Yep.
space.
So that open
Section
space
there.
category is
Yeah,
limited
so
to the conservation, or
it's-
to the subdivisions?
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
perfect.
Yeah, so we show the parcels or we show the polygons, within
Yep.
the subdivision. But then from a land use perspective, they just get classified as open space. So we still maintain a tax parcel ID number with it, but they don't generate a tax bill.
Great. Thank you, that's a great suggestion. So I'll add that in a different shade to this conservation land
Okay,
map.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next section is just a brief overview of the zoning districts. To my knowledge, there hasn't been a change of zoning districts since the 2012 plan.
No. Right. Yeah.
And there's obviously quite a range of size of the different zoning districts. Farm and forest comprises almost 50% of the land, and Dock Square at 7 acres is less than 1% of the town. The average lot size by district ranges from less than a fifth of an acre to 10 acres. So there's quite a bit of variation. I added in this graphic to help compare some of the similarities and differences across the different zoning districts. One of the comments that I noticed in the 2012 plan was that there's not a lot of distinction between some of the different zoning layers, zoning districts. So this graphic is intended to compare how those districts are similar and different. So the lower you are on the vertical axes, the smaller your lot size and the greater residential density or dwelling units per acres are permitted in the districts relative to the other districts. And then the farther right you move on the horizontal axis, the sort of more diversity in different types of uses that are allowed in those districts. But I found that a lot of the uses are quite similar in, in the forest and farm, free enterprise, Cape Porpoise, Dock Square, riverfront zone. They're fairly similar. The lot size obviously differs quite a bit in those districts. Village Residential East, Goose Rocks, Village Residential Zone, and Cape Arundel are very similar uses and lot size. So there's just one contract zone in Kennebunkport, Goat Island contract zone. This contract zone was established to enable the reconstruction of a number of historically significant structures, while also allowing for recreational and educational opportunities for the general public, with some conditions and restrictions. So the contract zone basically allows some differences that relate to physical development or how the property's operated compared to what the zoning would allow. And then the shoreland zone, establish a 50-foot setback for structures except in Dock Square and the riverfront zones, where a less restrictive 25-foot buffer was adopted. And this was a recommendation in the 2012 plan, I believe. And I was wondering if anyone knows offhand when that change
Yeah, I
occurred.
can pull out the year. I don't.
Okay.
I want to say that occurred. So this is going to sound weird because it's a 2012 plan, but I want to say that that change occurred in 2010.
So well, some of the chapters were developed.
That's right.
Yeah,
So
before then.
Yeah, even though it's
Okay.
2012, you had chapters that were voted on between 2006 and 2012.
Okay.
So, but yeah, because I think the latest version of Shoreland Zone Map that we have is a 2010 version, which would have been done because of
that.
yeah,
Okay,
because of those
perfect.
changes. But I'll verify that one. The only note that I had on that was that Dock Square has the 25-foot setback, but the riverfront maintains a 75.
Oh, really?
Yep, and even though it's general development,
Okay.
it has
Okay.
so it has the other characteristics of general development, but it has
But
the
it has this-
has the
okay.
75.
Well, that's complicated. All right, thank you. Is anyone interested in seeing any maps that show the shoreland zoning in areas of town in this chapter?
Is that a map that would get updated?
So it gets voted upon.
Gets
you know.
voted upon.
So
Just-
what you would have as an exhibit here would be, whatever the current map is at the time, that's been voted, upon. So is the thought process for the comp plan, are we going to have a separate map appendix for this, or we're having them kind of spread throughout in the different chapters?
Well, we're definitely going to include them in the text. If you would like a separate map appendix with like full page maps, we would maybe orient them vertically so
Right.
that they could be a little bit bigger, then we could certainly add that on.
Just wondering on, what we include in here is in maps and charts and so forth. There's gonna be a point in time versus, 3 years from now or 4 years from now, it could change. That's good. I mean, that's okay, but then the plan won't be representative of what's truly has changed. And so we had some discussion in the previous plan that we'd have, a way to update those changes within the comp plan without having to send the whole thing back for a vote.
Yeah, I mean,
Had
I
that
think
discussion
something,
anyways.
I think something like the shoreland zoning map, I mean, you would incorporate the one that's in effect at the time,
Yeah.
whatever had been voted upon, at the time. The struggle we had was with updating data,
Yeah.
Yeah.
data that wasn't really, I would say not really debatable, like if, in terms of if we had charts that were, that were documenting building permits over time.
Right.
Well, that's not, it's a factual number.
Mm-hmm.
How do we update that data without sending a comp plan all the way back through a whole other process?
Well, you'll have your zoning, you would have your shoreline, an official zoning and shoreline map that would, supersede anything
Yeah, it
that's
gets
in your
voted upon
comp plan.
Yeah.
So,
Do we-
I mean, I don't see a huge concern
Okay.
with having the current zoning at the time that the plan was
Yeah.
adopted in your plan. The plan has a date on it,
Yeah.
there might be, you could have a more current version
So we just
on
have
your
maybe-
website, but your land use map at the time of preparing the comprehensive plan isn't,
Yeah.
that's not going to change.
Right.
It's a static
So should we have
Piece
just a
in time.
comment, or what other towns do? Do they have a comment, just references that these maps and charts are a point in time? And if you want the most current data, go to the actual source or something like that?
You could do
Yeah.
that, yeah.
It depends really on how much updating you plan on doing
Usually a
in
committee like
between.
yours will sit around and say, whoa, we better update this plan.
Yeah,
There you go.
Okay.
Been there.
yeah. I mean, it's important to have a current zoning map if you do make changes, but that will exist in a
Yeah.
separate location,
Yeah.
and the shoreline would be
For sure. I
part
mean,
of
they-
that.
Yeah, they should be updated. And then if there's significant enough change that impacts the plan, then yes, we should go back and take a peek at it
Yeah,
and see if we need to make a
Yeah, you
change.
could also create an appendix too, that's comprised of, data that's, is updated, but
Yeah.
it just hasn't been sent to
Sure.
town meeting yet.
Okay.
yeah.
Maybe that's why we do it,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we have it as an appendix
have an
that
appendix.
Yeah,
is
that
available, but
makes the
doesn't
most sense.
necessarily, something that doesn't necessarily get voted on, because it's just an exhibit to the plan.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're not regulatory in nature.
Right.
So they're informational. All right, so, the next section, that I wanted to dive into briefly was the growth rate areas and the permits issued in different growth rate areas. So I have displayed the growth rate areas, rural and green, yellow is the transition, and the light peach color is the growth area, and the growth management permits issued at different locations, since, 2012. And, the pie chart just displays, the location of where the 47 growth permits that were issued between 2012 and 2019 were located, and about a third were located in each of the different growth areas. I did have a question about these sort of extra in-between transition areas.
Right, I was just gonna ask,
I
the,
started trying to edit them out, and then I said maybe I should figure out what they are first.
yeah, these,
The blue and the orange.
right. Right. So what you may be looking at here is, I suspect, is an update in the parcel lines. So when the first, I think, when we did the first growth area map, we were using 2010 parcels.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we had, we went through a pretty significant, redigitization, of the parcels. So I suspect what we might be finding here is just some of the, the rifts between the two data sets, where we've got, well, the one, I can tell you that the Goose Rocks one, that one's changed over there, so we can give you updated information for that area off of New Biddeford Road.
Yeah.
But these other ones, that
Some of them are split in between.
some of them are split,
Yeah.
and what I'm thinking is that you may have had a polygon that got tagged as being in one zone, the boundary line changed, and it went along with it. So if there's additional land that may have been added to it, and that might be why it doesn't match up. But some of them don't. They don't make any. They don't make any sense. This blue one out. Out in between transition and farm and forest. And then same thing with these other pink ones. So I'll have to take a look at the data.
Okay.
To see
Yeah,
how those want to get classified.
I started editing the growth area
Yeah.
to try to reflect what the other version, the
Yeah.
PDF version was.
Well, we
but-
tried to follow property boundaries.
Yeah.
And so.
Okay. All right, well, we'll get rid of the two
Yeah.
kind of in-between zones.
Yeah, yeah, we just gotta figure, we'll look at those parcels and decide
Where they
which
belong.
category they fall into.
Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds
Yeah.
good. This, this chart shows, the permit trends, from 2013 to 2019. What I've shown is the number, so the bars and the left axis show the number of permits that were issued. And then the dotted line corresponds with the right vertical axis, and that shows the percent of the permits issued of the total that were available. So the growth rate permits have, I believe consistently, there have been 40 permits available total. 50% go to the growth area, 30% go to transition, and 20% go to rural. So wherever 100% of the permits were issued, there were, it looked like 3 instances in 2015. You can see a dot above transition, and that indicates that 100% of the permits that were available that year for the transition area were issued. Similarly, there were 2 instances when all 8 of the rural permits were allocated in 2017 and 2018. And then the shading in the background just shows the total percent of permits that were issued of the total that were available. So, I mean, in general, it seems like there are still permits available for people interested. And again, these are just for residential dwelling units, not for commercial uses. Are there any questions on that?
No, just the one question I had, which is my eyes are hard. I had a hard time telling the difference between the two, the growth
Colors?
used and the transition used, the dotted lines.
Okay,
Especially
I
when I was
can-
looking at it on my iPad.
all
It's a little
right.
clear on this paper, but.
That's easy to change, the
Yeah.
colors.
But we did notice, I mean, that led to some meetings last year about the rural permits being all consumed,
Yeah.
and there was a need for one, so.
Has there been discussion about changing the growth rate areas?
We did a little bit.
We did a little bit, not so much, I guess the definition behind what the growth area is, as much as, I mean, we changed it because the infrastructure changed.
Yeah.
So it allowed us to expand what the growth area and transition area was as the basis, within 1,000 feet of infrastructure. So that's how we ended up changing that area. That's why that area that's in blue out in the Goose Rocks area changed.
Right, yeah,
It's
that
actually
one.
now part of the transition area.
Part of the trend.
Yeah. But no, there hasn't been any real discussion about how we change permits.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this
For
is
the
good,
time.
this
Yeah,
is good
no,
to
it
see
shows good.
visually how, where the demands have been.
Yeah. Right.
And I mean, I think we knew it, we knew it based on the numbers. You can see where the demand is. I think it's, it would, I know what the data would show, but it would be interesting also just to throw in the sales prices, land sales prices along with it, and I mean, you can see that, what we know is that, the affordable land is in the rural area,
Right.
and yet it's also the area that's the most restricted, in terms of residential development. Interestingly enough, yeah, it's interesting how how transition kind of jumps around.
Yeah.
A lot of, but I think it's an important question to ask and this is an opportunity to kind of step
Sure,
back, look at
absolutely.
the data and say, all right, so, is the growth cap in its current configuration and its allocation accomplishing the goals of the comp plan. So what's been the results of it, for the past, since 2013, whenever it underwent, a significant rewrite.
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that you are like maxing out in the rural areas does show that you're potentially limiting the development out in those areas that don't have the infrastructure and where you're not targeting the development. But I think
Right.
it is, I can see how it's challenging when you have, infrastructure that doesn't align with your growth areas perfectly, and your zoning boundaries don't align with your growth areas either, so it can be hard to target development in areas that you want to,
Yeah, I mean,
with
during
all
the
those
last,
different pieces.
during the last rewrite, one of the things that we didn't want to touch was the boundaries of the zones. Because that was kind of sacrosanct, I guess, at the time. And maybe it's up for discussion now, but at the point we felt if we started to, well, let's get rid of the residential east and residential west, we'll call it something else and do this, that it would be too much blowback for what we were trying to achieve. So we decided that, well, we were just gonna leave that alone, and to deal with this whole growth, we'll just come up with these zones where we want to try to drive growth too. Because I think in here you note how, well, not necessarily everyone that goes to growth is gonna be on infrastructure anyways. They could be putting in a well and have a septic system. So it's not ideal, but that was kind of a compromise that we kind of worked through in 2012. Are things different today? Maybe. Maybe folks are a little more open to looking at their zones and not being so attached to, I'm in this one and I'm in this one.
Yeah, I mean, the way I understand kind of the history is that, when zoning was created in the 70s, it was kind of there was a lot of uses that got thrown into the mix, I mean, you see that in the tables today, that were kind of, I don't want to say catch-alls, but they were catch-alls, and I think it was, I suspect it was done as a compromise to get zoning enacted in the first place, so you enact zoning, but you throw in all these categories of all these uses. So, I mean, interestingly enough, I don't think we have 3/4 of the uses that are listed, don't show up really in any of the zones. Certainly the market's done what the market has done, and, highest and best use has really shown that residential development is what, is the predominant, it's the predominant landscape here. And I think that's been that's one of the bigger questions is, at what point do you start, looking back at all those uses that you have listed in the plan and say, well, maybe it's time to cull some of these out because, in the past, 40 plus years, no one's actually put any of these things in and, ask the question of whether or not we actually want any of those types of uses.
Yeah, Liz and I went through that same exercise with the city of Saco last year, and you could tell some of that stuff had been floating around in the ordinance since the 1930s. They had professions and occupations that just don't exist anymore, but they're still in there.
Watchmaker.
Yeah, watchmaker was my best,
Watchmaker was a use?
Permitted use,
It
yeah.
was a permitted use, and so I asked if, your counterparts in Saco, said, so when's the last time you approved a watchmaker in this city, Of course, the watch business had left for China 30 years ago.
Could have been more interesting if you'd found hatters and cobblers.
Found some interesting ones. We had stenographers and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's a good, both, just reintroducing the topic of whether or not the zoning districts sort of meet the existing conditions and the needs and wants of the town is a great public input piece that we'll definitely want to touch on. And then thinking about, whether the districts need to, either modify their permitted uses one way or another.
Yeah.
It's definitely, it's not something that we necessarily go through the full process of doing in the comp plan, but it would be a recommendation and at least have some of the public input and backup information to know whether or not that's a recommendation that the town wants to move forward with.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you know, and I don't know how much of that you address in, you know, the current land use and how much of that gets addressed in future land use. You know, I think probably current land use, you know, I think maybe that gets broached, you know, the subject gets broached that, you know, since the 70s you've had X number of uses and here's how many instances in your data it shows that these uses exist. And, you know, I think it's a question that has to be broached.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few more pieces of information that need to go in this chapter, and then, at least that I'm aware of, and then obviously what you all are interested in including in this chapter versus the future land use chapter. I think it's a good point. It's probably a good idea to at least introduce it now. The more information that we have in this chapter, kind of set up and ready for when we bring information to some of the public input sessions, probably the better
Yeah.
prepared we'll be to have the discussion, so.
Yeah, I think we put
We'll add that in.
We put in the pros and cons of the way the current system is, right? And it identifies where those opportunities are to change, right? And so the fact that we have these 3 areas that don't really tie to zones and that there are multiple zones with uses that are likely never to occur again, you know, is a topic that we can put out here that we ought to consider looking at how we change that in the new plan.
Yeah.
In the next section.
Well, I'll see what I can tease out from the permit data.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, when you look at some of the uses, you know, you look at some of the uses that you could do in, you know, in free enterprise. I mean, for all practical purposes, in free enterprise, you could have a strip mall, you know, in there. But yet, I mean, imagine the chaos and mayhem that would ensue, you
We
know,
will.
Yeah, right.
should somebody come forward and say, "Hey, I think we want to put a strip mall here."
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, those are the types of things that I think are worthy of kind of bringing forward in a discussion because, you know, as the populace has changed, you know, I don't, and we get further away from the generation that developed the initial zoning ordinance. I don't think a lot of people actually necessarily know like what all kinds of uses could occur.
They definitely do not, because they all live in a residential zone. And the minute,
Well,
that's
remembers Andy's barn.
Yeah,
Couldn't go up because it was a residential zone. Well, sorry,
right.
you're in free enterprise.
Right. And not that was a, you know, I mean, not that was an inappropriate use.
No.
But it was just, it comes as a shock to some folks.
Yeah.
You know.
All right, speaking of uses, I pulled out the new commercial construction data from the last 10 years of building permits issued, and found that, speaking of the free enterprise district, over half of the permits for new commercial construction were issued in the free enterprise zone, followed by Goose Rocks and the riverfront area. Here is a map that shows the parcels on town sewer with their growth rate areas, and we did later receive GIS data with just the sewer lines, I believe. So we'll be able to incorporate that information into our maps and chapters as well now. I think, Dan, as you alluded to before, there are definitely opportunities to develop in any of these districts in areas that aren't on sewer. So even though you might be building a new dwelling unit in a growth area, it's likely that there's the opportunity that you might be doing so in an area that doesn't have access
Right.
yet to the infrastructure.
And of course, the Goose Rocks area does have access, but you could see that it was it's pretty well developed already.
Yeah.
So we left that in the transition zone instead of sticking, putting that in growth along with.
Here's that map that I mentioned that shows the town-owned land and then the unsecured conservation land. I'll make sure that we have the most current data for this map also. I added in the village parcel. We didn't have that in the parcel data, but we of course knew about that, that lot. And included a pretty brief introduction to the village parcel in the chapter at this point, and I imagine that we'll be providing some more context and information in that section of this chapter as plans progress for the village parcel.
Yep.
We haven't included a full map of the town-wide map showing sea level rise and storm surge vulnerability in this chapter. That's something that we could do. I thought it might fit in the water resources chapter, but we could easily incorporate some of that information into this chapter as well. I think that looking at this data will be really interesting when we're looking at sort of the future land use planning and vulnerable areas. So the data in this map shows different sea level rise and storm surge scenarios that were, this data was developed by the Maine Geological Survey, and it shows basically flooding on top of the highest astronomical tide, or HAT, from 1.2 feet to up to 10.9 feet of sea level rise, and the corresponding area of land that is impacted by townwide by that sea level rise scenario. So townwide is, over 3 square miles of land, up to 15% of the community could be impacted. Again, this is a very high scenario, but it's quite a significant amount of land. So when we get to doing more of the build-out analyses, we'll probably pick 1 or 2 of these different scenarios to use instead of using all, 6 of them.
What I was thinking is that we introduce here this concept and relevant to things that we've known have happened to date here. I mean, just last night I had a fire department meeting in here, and one of the members has a store down in the Dock Square area and has had a number of flooding episodes recently compared to the past, and almost had one the other day that came within a quarter inch of getting in the store again.
Wow.
So, I mean, so there's real-time stuff happening that maybe we can incorporate here and then have like the future stuff moving in with the water resource and certainly the future.
How would we get our hands on that stuff
Good
that's
question.
going on at present?
Yeah. If we had an insurance guy, he'd do insurance claims, right, for water. I don't know if any of that stuff, or permits have to come through to redo.
For some of these, projects, no, well,
They're just redoing it, right?
yeah, I mean, the damage is at this stage in the game is minor, it's
Just ripping out carpet.
it's
and putting in
it's
new
carpet,
and
it's it's the first 2-3 feet of sheetrock that we don't require a permit for. So there's there's no data for that, but yet we know it happens. I mean we know ServPro's doing its job out there when it comes to these
we
types
could
of storms.
Engage maybe the business community, the Rotary Club, to see if they've had any information on that. history of their members having to file for flood insurance claims.
Yeah, I think we should be
Fire
on able to
call
get
data.
that data from the state too.
The state maybe.
Yeah, the information on claims.
So I had a question on the floodplain section. So I'd written in what version was used.
Yeah.
You did note on there that it was the preliminary, but that may just want to be. We want to be clear that when we're talking to 43% of all parcels.
Yep.
I'm assuming that's all coming out of the preliminary.
It is,
Yep,
yeah.
Okay, that's what I figured. I don't know if we want to put anything in there about the difference between the prelims versus the currents. I know that's a lot more difficult to figure out, as far as how many are in the current, just because the spatial data is horrible.
Yeah. I mean, I can take a look at it and,
I may have some.
well, we could also compare like properties, the number of properties, because you
Yeah.
should have that, right? I would assume,
Well, I mean, we know
or at least the number
number of properties that have
flood insurance.
flood insurance.
Yeah.
So that's data that FEMA has. That tell us how many have.
Yeah.
How many policy.
But that's not going to cover everyone.
No. There's a lot of properties that don't have.
Right.
That don't have policies.
Um,
I'll look back through and see what I have. I may have the Q3 data still that I can send you. It's not great, but it's
Okay.
better than nothing.
All right. Yeah, it would be good to have something to compare.
Yeah, it's a significant difference between the two.
Yeah,
if you-
Tom mentioned that when I
yeah,
was
if you
talking
look
to
at-
him,
If you look
Tom,
at the Q3
about the GIS data.
and you look at the preliminaries, I suspect that'll probably cut in half.
Yeah,
Is my guess.
okay. All right, let me scroll to the next page. This does not show floodplains. We didn't include that in this current version of the development constraints map because you technically can develop in a floodplain if you meet the standards, have enough freeboard. But the flood development in the floodplain, similar to development in some of these areas that are vulnerable to sea level rise, is something that I think is worthy of having a discussion. What do you want to look at and include when you're considering where are the best areas for development to occur? This preliminary development constraints map that I put together includes sort of the bare minimum of some basic natural features that are a barrier to development: poorly drained and very poorly drained soils, steep slopes, swamps and wetlands, tidal areas, rivers and ponds. And this data was aggregated and included in everything you see in blue in this map here. I also included conservation land. I'll add the updated conservation lands data to that. And the developed land, which I included as a sort of a development constraint because it's already developed. So everything in the peach color is sort of the remaining other land. It's about 40% of the town, but I do want to make sure to highlight that this doesn't include any of your sort of local setback regulations. It doesn't reflect all of the development or your dimensional standards. So there are quite a few additional factors: impervious surface thresholds on a lot basis. There's quite a few additional factors that will further constrain development. So you can't, go in and develop 40 more 40% of the town right
Yeah,
now.
it's
Yeah.
tough to tease that
Yeah.
out, you know, at
Yeah.
this,
Oh,
at
yeah,
this
you can't.
scale.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
And
that's-
I don't think we need to. I think it'd be too difficult for one.
No, I think it's
For
just,
the-
you
for the
just
benefit.
address it and, you
But
know,
it's, yeah,
Yeah,
disclaim it.
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah,
Rock or wet?
Yep.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's a good map.
So, I'll just go through some of the state requirements quickly, similar to what Tom did for for the historic resources chapter. So I have a couple questions that I want to ask you, and I'll, point out a few areas where I'll be adding additional information into this chapter. For this chapter, there's no state goal required or minimum policy or strategy at the state level. There's a few analyses that are required. Is most of the recent development occurring lot by lot in subdivisions or in planned developments? Is recent development consistent with the community's vision? I'm curious what your thoughts are on if recent development has been sort of consistent with what you think the community's vision is, and with the sort of different visions for each of the, well, they're not zones, but the districts described in the current plan. Retail in Dock Square, municipal services in the Village Residential, Main Street area, riverfront area as marinas, yacht clubs, visitor slips. Cape Arundel retains its 19th century resort character. Goose Rocks is sort of family-oriented with cottage-style houses. Cape Porpoise has village stores oriented towards basic goods such as groceries and hardware. Free enterprise encompasses a broad range of
Not gonna
uses. Those are sort of the highlights from the vision of the 2012 plan.
Yeah.
And I know that's sort of a difficult question to ask if you think that the development aligns with those visions. Is there anything that jumps out as not aligning with what you picture in different areas of town?
I would let the Goose Rocks folks speak about Pinnacle Hill. I would imagine that doesn't really fit with the small cottage.
Nothing
Family
fits
area,
with the
so-
small cottages anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I
I
mean, it's
mean,
different.
There's certainly, I think, a mix of, I think what may have been hopes, wishes, and desires, and some of that I think is retro, is retrospective of how it used to be.
Yeah.
I think some of those statements contain some of that information. About.
Well, Dock Square certainly did, because we had hardware stores and grocery
Right.
stores and all kinds of things and gas stations, and we don't have them anymore.
Right.
Been there.
Yeah, so I think some of that, and that was probably what the 2001 vision statements.
Yeah.
I think some of that was, again, people reminiscing back to, oh, it would have been great to have, it'd be great to have a hardware store again. I've heard that one numerous times.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But, the market hasn't really,
No.
borne that out, that, that one would show up.
Yeah,
So, as an
exactly.
example, so.
Okay.
It's a good question. I guess
Yeah.
it's a mixed result.
Yeah, and
Right,
it's
it's a
something
mixed
that,
result.
as we go through the public
have
input
to-
sessions, that we'll be kind of working to tease out
Yeah.
what is the community's vision for different areas of town, and do the current sort of regulations support that?
Well, in a grand scheme, we know we struggle with, school children for support, for our school,
Yeah,
right? And that's kind of on the bigger scope, and that's why we got the whole workforce housing, affordable housing, housing trust, working on that aspect.
mm-hmm,
But by zone, it's a lot more difficult to.
Well, and I think that was, I think of the surveys that were done, where, Yes, some folks definitely knew where they lived, in terms of the zoning districts, but others, I think identified kind of based on the character of the area that they lived in, and so trying to, tease some of that information out was tricky. Because when when you ask folks, what do you envision the area that you live in, well, I mean, do you live in Free Enterprise, which is really a pretty highly
Yeah.
mixed use area?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
You know,
Nope, live in a residential area.
that's right. Maybe yes, maybe no.
No.
But I think the results of that survey are good. I think if you didn't have any zoning, and you were starting from scratch, and you were looking at that community survey, the areas there would almost lend you to the zoning districts. You'd kind of, if you went back from scratch, you'd do it based on your, here's what you have for development, and here's, and if you want to keep it the way that it is, then you look at what you have and you craft it around that way. But
That would maybe be a lot of change.
that would be a lot of change,
Yes.
and I think,
Yeah.
and it's, I think it was the direction that the 03 and the 05, plans went, and I think it was too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I think was pretty clear, but.
Yeah, and that one of the statements in the vision for Dock Square is that the commercial area will cover the same area it does now. I mean, you can't say it any more clearly than that. Like, it won't expand or shrink.
Right.
Give
it the way that it is.
Yeah. So one of the other pieces that that I'll need to incorporate into this chapter is information about administrative capacity to manage land use regulation program, including planning board and code enforcement officer. So what's your general sense on like capacity, the town's capacity to implement its regulations?
The planning board is, there's always stuff on the agenda with the planning board. It would be interesting to do a comparison with other communities in terms of kind of, what goes through planning board. I mean, we have some meetings where, we may have one or two items on an agenda, and there are other meetings when there's certainly more than that. Wintertime, there's not a whole lot going on. So, I think, generally speaking, it's a volunteer board, so I
Yeah.
don't want to sit here and say, oh, they've got more capacity,
Yeah.
for that. But
Do you feel like you have the town has enough staff to
to manage the planning board applications that come in on that side of it, yeah, I think
planning board and
we're fine with
planning in
that.
general, yeah.
Well, and, in terms of planning in general, I mean, if I look at it from a positional perspective, I mean, my position is split between, it's titled, Director of Planning and Development, but it's really what it is. It's, it's code enforcement and planning, and so, in an ideal world, would there be more time spent, towards, broader discussions and, more specific planning projects? Yes, but I would say, hour for hour, I'd probably still devote more time to the code enforcement role. But I'll also have one other full-time code officer and a part-time code officer as well. So over the past couple of years, we've it's been busy, and so have we turned out the permits in the timeliness that I would want? No. We hit, but it was because of the demand. Projects have certainly gotten more complicated. The building code's gotten more complicated. As properties become harder and harder to develop, we maintain a closer and closer eye on those, and so the documentation up front is you know, it sometimes gets pretty extensive.
Mhm.
You know, so I will say that, you know, and I've been preaching this one for a while, that, you know, once flood maps, these new revised flood maps go into effect, it's going to add another regulatory layer, you
Yeah.
know, and that's why I'm kind of looking at that comparison between current flood mapping versus future flood mapping, and, you know, because if we have, what do we say, 43% of parcels that are affected in some way, shape, or form by the flood maps, you know, and so think of every single building permit then that comes through that affects, you know, up to 40, maybe, you know, maybe not 43%, but let's say
Right.
30% of the permits that come in now wind up with an additional regulatory layer on top
Yeah.
of them, you know, that has to go through, you know, how much money are you spending on your project? What's the value of your building? Does that now mean you've got to jack the building up? You know, and that's going to add another layer of time.
Yeah.
So, what staffing look like for the future? You know, I don't know. I mean, we'll see, we'll see when it hits us.
Well, that's a good summary, thank
Right.
you. What about, has the planning board basically been full as far as the number of members?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, that's good.
yeah. We haven't. Yeah, we don't really have any. Don't sit with any vacancies.
Vacancies?
No.
Great.
No, and, I mean, the whole GPC was created just because the planning board didn't have the time really to deal with this part. Right, so,
Yeah,
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
true.
yeah. At the
Yeah.
time when growth plan
I'll add
was
that in.
created, it was, you know, unique in the sense that there's a separate standing committee just for the comp plan. You know, I mean, that's not common in Maine. You know, and really most communities, the planning board gets tasked with,
right.
you know, with the comp plan as well. So,
and we're full.
happen.
We have 5 full-time members and 2 alternates, so. There was a period of time where we got pretty thin, but they all jumped right on board that following election, so it was great.
Okay, I think I just have a couple more slides here. So we did talk about floodplains. Adequately identified and protected, I think that we kind of covered that information. I'll add a little bit in to make sure it's clear that the discussion is that the numbers pertain to the preliminary maps, and then we'll try to get some comparison. And then I'll add that into the discussion on capacity also, because I think that's an interesting point there. And minimum data, I think that we pretty much covered all of that in the chapter. Existing land use, summary of current lot dimensional standards, description and map identifying location of lots, structures created within the last 10 years, and description of existing land use regulations. I haven't included anything about the subdivision ordinance, but that is something that I will tie in. Maybe I'll highlight that in the discussion, or in the section on conservation land, to highlight some of the conservation subdivisions. And then there's, I think, opportunity to include a little bit more in the section on the zoning ordinance too.
so just to be clear, just on some of the dates,
Yeah,
and I don't know how picky you want to be with this or not, but
I want to
Yeah.
have them right.
right. So subdivision ordinance, for example. So
Yeah.
I can get you the latest, you know, the latest version. But what was really changed, and the same thing with floodplain. It says 2018, but I think all we did is we took the fee structure out of the floodplain ordinance, you know, and put it with our table of fees. So it's a little bit misleading to say 2018 because it wasn't really substantively modified in 2018. It was just essentially an administrative change.
Okay.
Again, I don't know how picky you want to get with it, but
I think it's more of a question for you. I put the dates that are on
Right.
the regulations themselves. If you want, I can include,
Most recent.
No, I think you keep those dates, because that's what people are
Okay.
gonna go to, right?
That- yeah,
You gotta grab
right.
the- Okay, this is the 218, that's the one I want.
Yeah.
Have the same stuff that was in the 213.
That's right. I mean, it references the correct document, you know.
Yeah.
I just pointed out
Yeah.
that,
Is
you
there
know.
a need to update it at any
Yeah, it's-
required frequency?
Well,
That
yes,
would be the
so,
only
I
part.
mean, whenever the, when we get new maps, or when we get through this process that we've been going through, then, we'll go through a comprehensive update of the floodplain management ordinance. I mean, in some sense, you could get away with the current language and just update the map references, so instead of, maps from 88 and 83, you're referencing, an updated date. But it's, I mean, it hasn't really been touched since 99, I want to say, so it's in need of kind of a little bit of an overhaul, so.
And that's your area of expertise, right?
It's sort of turned that way. But,
Okay. But there's no requirement to, without changes to the flood maps, to go through and update it?
correct, that's right, yep,
With with the comp plan, you gotta do it every 10 years.
that's right, yep.
Okay.
Covered that. And then just the last slide here on this, thanks for being patient here. Some of the key issues I think that we'll want to work through and get some public input on are alignment of growth rate areas with zoning and sewer. Again, this is not something that we're suggesting is changed at this point. It's just a topic that we want to bring up.
Yep.
Assessing whether regulations are helping to promote desired development. We talked about that a little bit tonight, but that will be something that we refine more once we have a good picture of what the desired development is, what the community is interested in. We talked about the floodplain map, the village parcel, and another development that's up and coming. Whether or not the town and committee want to sort of highlight other types of land use in this chapter. There's very little industrial land use, but we could dive into that a little bit more. Impervious cover, et cetera. So if you do think of an area that you want to focus on a little bit more, please let us know. And then the development constraints map and sort of build-out maps that we'll be working on. Any other key issues that you can think of or that you're interested in? Paul, you've been very quiet. Oh, you're on mute. Oh, hello? Great.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, so, hold on one second. I was wondering, there was a key issues section starting on page 97 of the old comp plan. And I was wondering whether we would take a look at that and have a section in the existing section we've just covered to sort of look at that and see what happened to that. Are they still key issues? Were they dealt with? Et cetera. It's like 5 pages.
Yeah, I did look at that. Let me see if I can pull that up quickly. Sorry, I don't have a mouse.
I hate when I can't use my mouse.
I mean, some of them we've talked about, like permitted uses. But there are others that we've not talked about.
Nope, this isn't the right section. You said page 97?
97 is what I'm looking at from the town website.
I know what you're talking about because I looked at it.
It's in,
Well, while I scroll for this, is this something that you would like to see in this
well, it seems.
existing land use section?
Well, it seems like you would want to know what happened with this when it was important enough to recommend, as open issues.
Is it land use ordinance?
Certainly,
Oh,
it might be,
right here.
Here it is, yeah,
Right there.
okay.
yeah, a topic of discussion anyways, to kind of go through and say, all right, here's what were identified issues, and, are they still issues enough that they want to be rehashed in this updated plan, or are they no longer issues?
Sure, so the issues here, and just in case you can't read them from where you are, water quality and supply, related to commercial and large-scale residential developments that aren't affected to public water and sewer, that have an adverse impact on existing aquifers. I was under the impression that most of the drinking water came from outside of Kennebunkport.
Does,
Now, it still uses aquifers water from somewhere, but
Branchwood.
but I think the point is maybe the overall demand for water, might be strained with larger developments.
Well, I think this was for not connected.
Yeah.
And
So the
Yeah.
impact
Oh, for
on
not
that
connected.
one, yeah.
wells.
Yeah.
Okay.
Impact on
Yeah.
wells.
Yep.
So it's a groundwater.
Groundwater, yep.
Supply issue.
So the question is that still a problem?
Well, I think it was a question that was brought up, I don't know that it was specifically identified as a problem, but I think it was a question that was brought up.
And we were building subdivisions where they had to have well water too.
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
And we do have saltwater problems that will become more prevalent.
Number 2 would fly well.
What was that, Barbara?
Yep.
Number 2,
Number
mobile
2.
home.
Yeah, mobile home parks.
That,
Is that still a hot topic in,
it would be, I think, if it were
Kennebunkport?
raised.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of, take on, when you look at the state law that says you can't not have them in your community, so you have to
Right.
have, and anywhere where you have, single families permitted, you have to permit, mobile homes. The mobile home park question is that, it's the same thing, you can't just have a small segregated zone, that, this is where we would allow mobile home parks and nowhere else in town. So, I mean, I think, is it an issue? I
Not
mean,
right now.
not at this particular point. But could it be an issue in the future?
Oh, yeah.
It could.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's one of those.
Look at the fun we had with affordable housing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it my sense is that it depends on how it's going to get used. I mean, it's if you were having a conversation about a mobile home park that is typical of what folks see in Wells, as maybe as seasonals, that would be one conversation. Or if you were looking at 1-box, 2-box modulars that were year-round residents, I think it'd be a different conversation, I think. So,
well, that's probably something that we'll flag to get some more input on. Again, we're doing this a little bit backwards, writing a lot of this first. But I think since for some of these issues, the water quality and supply question, some of that information might surface when we're doing the water resources chapter. And then we could sort of connect it back to this chapter. Mobile homes, that didn't jump out at me as an issue, but it certainly could be an issue that, you know, I'm not aware of. So it'd be great to get some input on that from the community, I think.
We talked about the permitted uses.
We talked about the permitted uses. There was discussion around the use of net square footage versus gross square footage in determining buildable lots.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it's, so when you look at, well, you know, you take the constraints map as a perfect example, you know, and it's, you know, it's a question of, you know, whether or not, you know, so the town has required, you know, on, say, like individual lot splits.
Yep.
You know, the use of net area versus gross area for lot. And so, in particular where, you know, it, you know, where it gets challenging is in when you've got a 3 acre minimum, and, you know, I mean, you have the constraints map, so you know what we're dealing with. So there's not really, in the grand scheme, there's not really a lot of, you know, newly created 3 acre minimum lots. It's more, at the end of the day, it really winds up being more, you know, like 6 acre lots as opposed to 3. So when you say 3 acre minimum lot size, it's somewhat misleading because by the time, you know, with the constraints that we deal with, yeah, it usually winds up being significantly larger than that.
Existing standards for commercial development are not adequate to minimize unwanted impacts on neighboring parcels.
There's your dark square answer again.
Yeah.
Not one.
Do you see a lot of outcry from the public when commercial redevelopment and development occur?
Well, I think it goes back to that question of do you know what zone you live in?
Mhm.
You know, and do you know? I mean, you know, there's a lot of general there's a lot of general language in the site plan specs that, you know, depending on the planning board that you have, you know, will interpret that differently, you know, over the course of the years, and you know, I think, you know, this I see as there's a lot of opinion as to whether or not it's adequately addressed. You know, some folks may say, well, I don't want it there to begin with, and so if it even shows up, then that's not,
Yeah.
it hasn't been adequately addressed, because I just don't want it next to me in the first place. Whereas, you know, I mean, yeah, you may have buffering standards, you know, you've got coverage standards, you have, you know, we have a lighting ordinance that regulates, you know, the type of lighting, you know, that can occur, but, you know, for some folks, that's still, you know, it's
Never going to be enough.
it's never going to be enough. So,
But that's all over.
yeah, I mean, that's, you know, it's kind of,
NIMBY is alive and well.
it's a general statement, and so it'd be,
That really goes back to the permitted uses
right, it does. It goes back to the permitted uses question.
versus, you know, versus a actual commercial development. What
Right.
we don't like about it, not so much because it's
Right.
there, but because it
Yeah.
impacts traffic or whatever it may be.
Right. I mean, you know, a noise issue that may be brought up could be because a property, you know, has larger vehicles on it that have backup beepers, you know. I mean, you can't, you know, can't
Yeah.
tell people to shut off their backup beepers, you know, but
Right.
yet, but yet, you know, I think, you know, someone reading that would come out and say, well, that's you know, you're not adequately protecting me from an unwanted impact of a backup beeper. But
Okay. Another issue was square footage and volume matters.
Yeah.
Private roads that have experienced intensive individual lot division take on characteristics of a subdivision. However, they don't meet the subdivision requirements.
I
So
mean,
like
I
a
think
parcel
that's-
by lot subdivision kind of
That's a good question to ask. I mean, I don't necessarily see that rampant, but, I mean, this is one of those fundamental questions of subdivision regulations in the state of Maine, where you have this vast list of exemptions from subdivision review. The 5-year split, the family divisions and things like that, you don't have an open space requirement for a family division because it's not technically a subdivision. So, this is one of those questions I think you beat your head against a wall on a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yes,
Because you're not gonna, I don't see in any near future where, state law changes that deals with that.
Serial subdivisions is what another community I work in
Well, I
calls
call
them.
them, I call them the non-subdivision subdivisions.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, but,
Okay. Overlay zoning, this is an issue that you did address.
yeah,
This was that reduced setback area. Distinctions in different zones, we talked about that a little. Arterial and feeder roads, setbacks along the roads are not adjusted to allow for future highway and infrastructure expansions. I think that's something that we'll probably push into the transportation chapter.
That's alive and well. Just come to Goose Rocks.
Village zones and patterns. Subdivisions along Route 9. It has been noted that extensions of the village pattern with small lots, low setbacks would not be permitted under existing zoning.
yeah, I think there's some carryover language there from, gosh, so some of those subdivisions was the last one that was reviewed was, Shawmut Woods.
Yeah.
It's probably the most recent one, and that was done in the early 2000s. So there might be some carryover language on, on some of this.
Okay. And then historic preservation, I think that's covered in historic resources now. So I think some of these issues, I pulled out a couple that I thought were more pertinent to existing land use that I could address without committee and public input, but we can definitely at least include a section that kind of references what these current sort of hot topics were in the land use chapter in 2012, if that's something that Paul, you and others are interested in, just as sort of a reminder of what some of the issues were and some of the topics I think we'll get some more public input on before including them in as sort of a current key issue. That makes sense.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay. Any other comments, questions, suggestions? All right. Tom is coming back up for a couple minutes. And
Not to worry, we'll be out of here by 10. Let's see, historic resources. Paul, are you still with us?
Yeah.
Excellent. We had several comments about the first draft of the historic resources chapter. Paul, you had some very good ones. So we've revised it. We're now on chapter 2. I did not send you out another 52 pages. I just sent you out the part that's been revised, just to make it easier to manage. And Paul, it was a good idea about mentioning the Great Fire of 1947, because that was a very important event in Kennebunkport. And it wasn't not in your 2012 comprehensive plan, but it certainly should be if you're talking about a brief history of the town, which is what that part of the chapter bills itself as. So we have two more paragraphs on the fire, and that's on page 13 now. Then on pages 45, 46, the narrative was talking about the Cape Porpoise Archaeological Alliance, and then the discovery of the dugout canoe, and then, you know, how climate change works itself into that story. And Paul made a comment that it wasn't very smooth. It was kind of jerking around. He was absolutely right about that. So I went back and rewrote pages 45, 46 to address that, and I think it reads a lot better now. And page 47, we have a, let's see, no, doesn't show here. If you look at page 47, there's a drawing, a measured drawing by the Historic American Building Survey.
Yep.
There's a front door of a house on North Street. House was built in 1812, and it's called, the feds called it the Larrabee Carl House, which apparently that's what it was called at one point, but it took me a few weeks to figure out which house they were talking about. So we now have a little caption below the illustration so that it can be properly identified. It's the house that's right on the corner of North Street and the little side street that goes down to where the grist mill was. I know it has a street name, I gotta get that too, I mean a street number.
West.
Hmm?
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that the Larrabee Carl House?
Yeah, that's what that's what it was called in the past, when the federal government sent some architects up to measure it and draw it. It was commonly known by that name at the time.
Was that Wayland's day?
I don't know. Talking about Mill Lane,
Yeah, Miller.
Yeah,
so it's the yellow one?
yes it is, it's a yellow house. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Right, no.
So these architects from Washington, they thought that particular house was a really good example of the federal style, so they documented it. Page 48. Paul brought my attention to an interesting event in 1951 where the Goose Rocks Beach Association building arrived on the beach. It came via sea up the coast, and it was such an interesting event that it ended up in Life magazine. So we've added that to our narrative on page 48, along with a picture of some people on the beach with a big rope that's attached to the building. And then we had kind of a blank space on page 48 after all that rearranging, so I found a nice photograph depicting the construction of a balloon-framed building around the middle of the 19th century, where you can see what the difference between a post and beam and a balloon frame. One of the main differences is the studs on a balloon frame ran right from the sill all the way up to the attic. Of course, that took a big tree to get up there, but you know, it's structurally it's kind of flimsy, and that's the problem with balloon frame. They were popular because they were easy and cheap. Yeah. And the last revision we made was a request to have a list of books for further reference on some of the topics that were covered in the chapter. So on page 52, you'll see suggestions for further read, and we have seven different volumes there that are all utilized in preparation of the chapter. So that's the revisions that I have addressed since our last meeting. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I just had a general comment. Back to my question earlier on how we're communicating these chapters, these drafts to the public. So when I go on the town's website, there's a nice new tab for 2030 comp plan. And it seems to be linking to the website, although I'm not clear. But I don't see any drafts, before a meeting. I thought we were going to be sharing with the public everything we were seeing. And maybe it's at the other website, which I can't remember the address.
The project
But it's not-
website?
The project website, but it's not, I can't get to it from the town website,
Okay,
which
well,
is how most people would find this.
that should be fairly easy to fix. That's simply a link. Here's, we are starting to fill in the blanks here. Here's the project website, and if you go here, click on the historic resources, it's gonna pull up the chapter we were just discussing. There we go. Except it's draft number 1. Tomorrow will be draft number 2. So if you can find your way to the project website, access the material is fairly straightforward. But,
But I think we need to have it accessible to everybody else.
yeah, so we need to check,
Means-
make sure the town website is sending people this way.
Yeah, we'll follow,
It's-
I'll follow up on that, see what that tab is doing.
If it's updating, is that what you're checking?
It doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, and,
Okay.
yeah, I was, here's a project
And I go
website. We do have the minutes posted for the last meeting. These are the ones you just adopted this evening.
And I go to the growth planning committee and I can't find it from there either.
When you go where, Paul?
I went to, each committee has a web page on the town.
Oh, okay.
So
Well,
I went in that way and I can't find it easily.
that's a pretty simple fix. I don't have access to the town website, but who's ever in charge of that, they can make
Yeah,
it
we'll
happen
take a
pretty
look.
quick.
We'll take a look at
Yeah.
that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Maybe one other suggestion, when we send out our notice to say the agenda, can we put a link on that so people could find the draft and know what we're going to be talking about?
Yes, we can. In fact, I know the last email had such a link in it. Wasn't on
But
the agenda,
you're
but it was
asking
in the
if it's
email.
in the agenda.
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking, if that link goes into the agenda?
Yeah,
Yeah.
people get the notice from the town and they get an agenda, but then it should be easy to,
Okay, we can
if-
do
if
that
they have
too,
the
yeah.
interest.
Yeah. We can make that happen.
Wonderful.
I just went into the town one, and you could find under the 2030 comp plan,
Yeah.
the different chapters, but when you click the chapter, nothing pops. Doesn't go anywhere. I just got a blank
On the town website?
on the town website.
Yeah.
I
Well,
tried
and what's
introduction and.
what's
it
tricky
may
with
not
the
be
town
there.
website, and I'm not sure what the fix necessarily is, but, whenever you click on that tab there, getting out of that small window that's there
Yeah.
on the home page to that, there's, there seems to be a disconnect between,
Yeah.
between the two.
But it should
Right.
be fairly direct. I mean,
Yeah.
who's ever doing
Yeah.
a town website just needs to do a link to send everybody here, and then.
Well, I mean, it does, it does link to it.
Yeah.
It links to it, but it doesn't take you to a separate tab.
Okay, well,
so-
that's a coding issue.
Yeah, it should open up, it
there
really
is-
should open up a
So
separate
you get
tab.
this. then
There
you-
is a code that says, open up a separate window.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It doesn't.
yeah, as opposed
So-
to, it just stays
Yeah,
within this
that-
little window on,
That also
on the
is easy to
page.
fix.
So I don't know if that's something on your end when that opens up, or if that's something
No,
I've
that's
gotta
on the
check
town
with
website,
virtual
yeah.
town hall on
Just,
that.
just, when you talk to virtual, tell them that they need to open this link on a new window.
Actually, I clicked introduction, and I just got the first picture. I can't get anything
Yeah.
else.
So I was just kidding about keeping it at 10, you know.
Yeah.
It
You're
was a
working
joke,
on
yeah.
it.
I thought you meant 10 of 9, but you only went by 5 minutes, so. Okay,
All right. That's all we have for you tonight.
very good. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Next meeting,
Next
So,
meeting
next meeting.
is scheduled for February 11. Second Tuesday.
okay.
I am pretty certain I'm here. For that one. Unless something changes, but I'm available for that one.
Which it generally
Yeah.
does. Okay,
I'm not available the second,
February 11th.
the second, 25th. But I would be here for the first one in March,
Okay.
Okay.
as of today.
Well, Jim's not here. So,
That's right, who's gonna adjourn?
guess we can.
No, you can,
I move we adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Move to adjourn. I second.
second. All in favor? Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much.